Hello everyone, I hope you're having a lovely evening or morning or afternoon wherever you are. Today we're going to be carrying on reading some more Howls Moving Castle. We were up to chapter 7 last time, so that's where I'm gonna just try and dive right into it. Just gonna get my other thing ready, then I can hit record so that then the editing software I use, I can actually record it separately from OBS and be able to add stuff to it later on. So if I press record now, la 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 la. Okay, yeah, it's picking up my voice. Cool. Although I'm rather quiet. Maybe now? For some reason, it's not picking up my voice as much as it used to, which is a bit of a concern. Because now, maybe I do need that up further? No? Oh dear, is that going to be a pain? Stop for a second. What do you set up? Recording device. It's the same. I mean, that's the best I'm going to be able to do, so hopefully it's not too obvious. I may need to. I love how I say I'm going to go right into it. And then, I'll get into it. I might need to re-record, but I was only going to do a short stream today anyway. So. Oh, nope. So, cut that what happened before. Alright, well, let's just get into it. So, chapter 7, in which Scarecrow prevents Sophie from leaving the castle. Only a particularly bad attack of aches and pains prevented Sophie from setting out for market chipping that evening. But the drizzle in Porthaven had got into her bones. She lay in her cubbyhole and ached and worried about Martha. It may not have been so bad, she thought. She'd only to tell Martha that the suitor she was not sure about was none other than Wizard Howl. That would scare Martha off. And then she would tell Martha that the way to scare Howl off was to announce that she was in love with him, and then perhaps to threaten him with ants. Sophie was still creaking when she got up the next morning. "Curse the witch of the waste," she muttered to her stick as she got it out ready to leave. She could hear Howl singing in the bathroom, as if he had never had a tantrum in his life. She tiptoed to the door as fast as she could hobble. Howl, of course, came out of the bathroom before she reached it. Sophie looked at him sourly. He was all spruce and dashing, scented gently with apple blossom. The sunlight from the window dazzled off his grey and scarlet suit and made a faintly pink halo of his hair. "I think my hair looks rather good in this colour," he said. "Do you indeed?" grumped Sophie. "It goes with this suit," said Howl. "You have quite a touch with your needle, don't you? You've given the suit more style somehow." "Huh," said Sophie. Howl stopped with his hand on the knob above the door. "Aches and pains troubling you?" he said. "Or has something annoyed you?" "Annoyed?" said Sophie. "Why should I be annoyed? Someone only filled the castle with rotten aspic and deafened everyone in Porthaven and scared Calcifer to a cinder and broke a few hundred hearts. Why should that annoy me?" Howl laughed. "I apologise," he said, turning the knob to red down. "The king wants to see me today. I shall probably be kicking my heels at the palace until evening, but I'll do something for your rheumatism when I get back. Don't forget to tell Michael I left a spell for him on the bench." He smiled sunnily at Sophie and stepped out among the spires in Kingsbury. "And you think that makes it all right?" Sophie growled as the door shut. But the smile had mollified her. "If that smile works on me, then it's no wonder poor Martha doesn't know her own mind." "I need another log before you go," Calcifer reminded her. Sophie hobbled to drop another log into the grate. Then she set off to the door again. But here Michael came running downstairs and snatched the remains of the loaf off the bench as he ran to the door. "You don't mind, do you?" he said, in an agitated way. "I'll bring a fresh loaf when I come back. I've got something very urgent to see today, but I'll be back by evening. If the sea captain calls for his wind spell, it's on the end of the bench, clearly labelled." He turned the knob green downwards and jumped out onto the windy hillside, loaf clutched to his stomach. "See you!" he shouted as the castle trundled away past him and the door slammed. "Botheration," said Sophie. "Calcifer, how does a person open the door when there's no one inside the castle? I'll open it for you, or Michael. Howl does it himself," said Calcifer. So no one would be locked out when Sophie left. She was not at all sure she would be coming back, but she did not intend to tell Calcifer. She gave Michael some time to get well on the way to wherever he was going, and set off to the door again. This time Calcifer stopped her. "If you're going to be away long," he said, "you might leave some logs where I can reach them." "Can you pick up logs?" Sophie asked, intrigued in spite of her impatience. For answer, Calcifer stretched out, a blue arm-shaped flame divided into green finger-like flames at the end. It was not very long, nor did it look very strong. "See, I can almost reach the hearth," he said proudly. Sophie stacked a pile of logs in front of the grate so that Calcifer could at least reach the top one. "You're not going to burn them until you've got them into the grate," she warned him, and she set off to the door yet again. This time somebody knocked on it before she got there. It was one of those days, Sophie thought. It must be the sea captain. She put up her hand to turn the knob blue down. "No, it's the castle door," Calcifer said. "But I'm not sure." Then it was Michael, back for some reason, Sophie thought as she opened the door. A turnip face leered at her. She smelled mildew again. Against a wide blue sky, a ragged arm ending in the stump of a stick wheeled round and tried to paw at her. It was a scarecrow. It was only made of sticks and rags, but it was alive, and it was trying to come in. "Calcifer!" Sophie screamed. "Make the castle go faster." The stone blocks around the doorway crunched and grated. The green-brown moorland was suddenly rushing past. The Scarecrow's stick arm thumped against the door and then went scraping along the wall of the castle as the castle left it behind. It wheeled its other arm around and seemed to try to clutch at the stonework. It meant to get into the castle, if it could. Sophie slammed the door shut. This, she thought, just showed how stupid it was for the elders to try and seek her fortune. That was the Scarecrow she had propped in the head on her way to the castle. She had made jokes to it. Now, as if her jokes had brought it to evil life, it had followed her all the way here and tried to paw at her face. She ran to the window to see if the thing was still trying to get into the castle. Of course, all she could see was a sunny day in Port Haven, with a dozen sails going up, a dozen masts beyond the roofs opposite, and a cloud of seagulls circling the blue sky. "Ah, that's the difficulty of being several places at once," Sophie said to the human skull on the bench. Then, all at once, she discovered the real drawback to being an old woman. Her heart gave a leap and a little stutter, and then seemed to be trying to bang its way out of her chest. It hurt. She shook all over and her knees trembled. She rather thought she might be dying. It was all she could do to get back to the chair by the hearth. She sat there panting, clutching her chest. "Something the matter?" Calcifer asked. Yes, my heart. There's a Scarecrow at the door," Sophie gasped. "What has a Scarecrow to do with your heart?" Calcifer asked. "It was trying to get in here. Oh, it gave me a terrible fright. And my heart. But you wouldn't understand, you silly young demon," Sophie panted. "You haven't got a heart." "Yes, I have," Calcifer said as proudly as he had revealed his arm. "Down in the glowing part, under the logs. And don't call me young. I'm a good million years older than you are. Can I reduce the speed of the castle now?" "Only if the Scarecrow's gone," said Sophie. "Has it?" "I can't tell," said Calcifer. "It's not flesh and blood, you see. I told you. I couldn't really see outside." Sophie got up and dragged herself to the door again, feeling ill. She opened it slowly and cautiously. Green steepness, rocks and purple slopes whirled past, making her feel dizzy. But she took a grip on the doorframe and leaned out to look along the wall to the moorland they were leaving behind. The Scarecrow was about 50 yards to the rear. It was hopping from clump to heather clump, with a sinister sort of valiance, holding its fluttering stick arms at an angle to balance it on the hillside. As Sophie watched, the castle left it further behind. It was slow, but it was still following. She shut the door. "It's still there," she said, "hopping after us. Go faster." "But that accepts all my calculations," Calcifer explained. "I was aiming to circle the hills and get back to where Michael left us in time to pick him up this evening." "Then go twice as fast and circle the hills twice, as long as you leave that horrible thing behind," said Sophie. "What a fuss," Calcifer grumbled, but he increased the castle's speed. Sophie could actually, for the first time, feel it rumbling around her as she sat in her chair, wondering if she was dying. She did not want to die yet, before she had talked to Martha. As the day went on, everything in the castle began to jiggle with its speed. Bottles clinked. The skull chattered on the bench. Sophie could hear things falling off the shelf in the bathroom and splashing into the bath where Howl's blue and silver suit was still soaking. She began to feel a little better. She dragged herself to the door again and looked out, with her hair flying in the wind. The ground was streaking past underneath. The hills seemed to be spinning slowly as the castle sped across them. The grinding and rumbling nearly deafened her, and the smoke was puffing out behind in blasts. But the Scarecrow was a tiny black dot on the distant slope by then. Next time she looked, it was out of sight entirely. "Good. Then I shall stop for the night," said Calcifer. "That was quite a strain." The rumbling died away. Things stopped jiggling. Calcifer went to sleep in the way that fires do, sinking among the logs until they were rosy cylinders plated with white ash, with only a hint of blue and green deep underneath. Sophie felt quite spry again by then. She went and fished 6 packets and a bottle out of the slimy water in the bath. The packets were soaked. She did not dare leave them that way after yesterday, so she laid them on the floor and very cautiously sprinkled them with the stuff labelled drying power. They were dry almost instantly. This was encouraging. Sophie left the water out of the bath and tried the power on Howl's suit. That dried too. It was still stained green and rather smaller than it had been, but it cheered Sophie up to find that she could put at least something right. She felt cheerful enough to busy herself getting supper. She bundled everything on the bench into a heap round the skull on one end and began chopping onions. "At least your eyes don't water, my friend," she told the skull. "Count your blessings." The door sprang open. Sophie nearly cut herself in her fright, thinking it was the Scarecrow again. But it was Michael. He burst jubilantly in. He dumped a loaf, a pie, and a pink and white striped box on top of the onions. Then he seized Sophie round her skinny waist and danced her around the room. "It's all right! It's all right!" he shouted joyfully. Sophie hopped and stumbled to keep out of the way of Michael's boots. "Steady! Steady!" she gasped, giddily trying to hold the knife where it would not cut either of them. "What is all right?" "Letty loves me," Michael shouted, dancing her almost into the bathroom and then almost into the hearth. "She's never even seen Howl. It was all a mistake." He spun them both round in the middle of the room. "Will you let me go before this knife cuts one of us?" Sophie squawked. "And perhaps explain a little." "Wee-yup," Michael shouted. He whirled Sophie to the chair and dumped her into it, where she sat, gasping. "Last night I wish you'd dyed his hair blue," he said. "I don't mind now. When Hal said Letty Hatter, I thought of dyeing him blue myself. You can see the way he talks. I knew he was going to drop this girl like all the others, and as soon as he'd got her to love him. And when I thought it was my Letty, Anyway, you know he said that there was another fellow, and I thought that was me. So I tore down to Market Shipping today, and it was all right. Hal must be after some other girl with the name Letty. My Letty's never even seen him." "Let's get this straight," Sophie said dizzily. "We are talking about the Letty Hatter who works in Cesari's pastry shop, are we?" "Of course we are," Michael said jubilantly. "I've loved her ever since she started to work there, and I almost couldn't believe it when she said she loved me. She has hundreds of admirers. I wouldn't have been surprised if Howl was one of them. Oh, I'm so relieved. I got you cake from Cesari's to celebrate. Where do I put it? Oh, here it is." He thrust the pink and white box at Sophie. Onion fell off it into her lap. "How old are you, my child?" Sophie asked. 15 last May Day," said Michael. "Calcifer sent fireworks up from the castle. Didn't you, Calcifer?" "Oh, he's asleep." "You're probably thinking I'm too young to be engaged. I've still got 3 years of my apprenticeship to run, and Letty's got even longer. But we promised one another, and we don't mind waiting." Then Michael was about the right age for Martha, Sophie thought, and she knew by now that he was a nice steady lad with a career as a wizard ahead of him. Bless Martha's heart. When she thought back to that bewildering May Day, she realised that Michael had been one of the shouting group leaning on the counter in front of Martha, but Howl had been outside in Market Square. "Are you sure your Letty was telling the truth about Howl?" she asked anxiously. "Positive," said Michael. "I know when she's lying. She stops twiddling her thumbs." "Oh, she does too," said Sophie, chuckling. "How do you know?" Michael asked in surprise. "Because she's my sister's granddaughter," said Sophie. "And as a small girl she was not always terribly truthful. But she's quite young and, I suppose she changes as she grows. Well, she may not look quite the same in a year or two." "Neither will I," said Michael. "People our age change all the time. It won't worry us. She's still my Letty." "In a manner of speaking," Sophie thought. "But suppose she was telling the truth," she went on anxiously. And she just knew Howl under a false name? Don't worry, I thought of that, said Michael. I described Howl. You must admit, he's pretty recognisable. And she really hadn't seen him. Or his wretched guitar. I didn't even have to tell her he doesn't even know how to play the thing. She never set eyes on him. And she twiddled her thumbs all the time. She said she hadn't. That's a relief, Sophie said, lying stiffly back in her chair. And it certainly was a relief about Martha. But it was not much of a relief, because Sophie was positive that the only other Letty Hatter in the district was the real one. If there had been another, someone would have come into the hat shop and gossiped about it. It sounded like strong-minded Letty not giving in to Howl. What worried Sophie was that Letty had told Howl her real name. She might not be sure about him, but she had liked him enough to trust him with an important secret like that. Don't look so anxious, Michael laughed, leaning on the back of his chair. Have a look at the cake I bought you. As Sophie started opening the box, it dawned on her that Michael had gone from seeing her as a natural disaster to actually liking her. She was so pleased and grateful that she decided to tell Michael the whole truth about Letty and Martha and herself too. It was only fair to let him know the sort of family he meant to marry into. The box came open. In it was Cesari's most luscious cake, covered in cream and cherries and little curls of chocolate. Oh, said Sophie. The square knob over the door clicked round to red blob down of its own accord, and Howl came in. Hang on a moment. Okay. And Howl came in. What a marvellous cake! My favourite kind, he said. Where did you get it? I called into Cesari's, Michael said, in a sheepish, self-conscious way. Sophie looked up at Howl. Something was always going to interrupt her when she decided to say she was under a spell. Even a wizard, it seemed. It looks well worth the walk, Howl said, inspecting the cake. I've heard Cesari's is better than any of the cake shops in Kingsbury. Stupid of me to never have been in the place. And is that the pie I see on the bench? He went over to look. Pie in a bed of raw onions. Human skull looking put upon. He picked up the skull and knocked an onion ring out of its eye socket. I see Sophie has been busy again. Couldn't you have restrained her, my friend? The skull yattered its teeth at him. Howl looked startled and put it down rather hastily. Is something the matter? Michael asked. He seemed to know the signs. There is, said Howl. I shall have to find someone to blacken my name to the king. Was there something wrong with the wagon spell? Said Michael. No, it worked perfectly. That's the trouble, Howl said, restlessly twiddling an onion ring on one finger. The king's trying to pin me down to do something else now. Calcifer, if we're not very careful, he's going to appoint me the royal magician. Calcifer did not answer. Howl roved back to the fireside and realised Calcifer was asleep. Wake him up, Michael, he said. I need to consult him. Michael threw 2 logs on Calcifer and called him. Nothing happened, apart from a thin spire of smoke. Calcifer! Howl shouted. That did no good either. Howl gave Michael a mystified look and picked up the poker, which was something Sophie had never seen him do before. Sorry, Calcifer, he said, jabbing under the unburned logs. Wake up! One thick, black cloud of smoke rolled up and stopped. Go away, Calcifer grunted. I'm tired. At this, Howl looked thoroughly alarmed. What's wrong with him? I've never known him like this before. I think it was the Scarecrow, Sophie said. Howl swiveled round on his knees and levelled his glass marble eyes at her. What have you done now? He went on staring, while Sophie explained. A scarecrow, he said. Calcifer agreed to speed up the castle because of a scarecrow? Dear Sophie, do please tell me how you bully a fire demon into being that obliging. I'd dearly love to know. I didn't bully him, said Sophie. It gave me a turn, and he was sorry for me. It gave her a turn, and Calcifer was sorry for her, Hal repeated. My good Sophie, Calcifer is never sorry for anyone. Anyway, I hope you enjoy raw onions and cold pie for your supper, because you've almost put Calcifer out. There's the cake, Michael said, trying to make peace. The food did seem to improve Hal's temper, although he kept casting anxious-looking looks at the unburning logs in the hearth all the time they were eating. The pie was good cold, and the onions were quite tasty when Sophie had soaked them in vinegar. The cake was superb. While they were eating it, Michael risked asking Hal what the king had wanted. Nothing definite yet, Hal said gloomily, but he was sounding me out about his brother, quite ominously. Apparently they had a good old argument before the Prince Justin stormed off, and people are talking. The king obviously wanted me to volunteer to look for his brother, and I, like a fool, went and said I didn't think Wizard Solomon was dead, and that made matters worse. Why do you want to sliver out looking for the prince? Sophie demanded. Don't you think you can find him? Rude as well as a bully, aren't you? Hal said. He had still not forgiven her about Calcifer. I want to get out of it, because I know I can find him, if you must know. Justin was great buddies with Solomon, and an argument was because he told the king he was going to look for him. He didn't think the king should have sent Solomon to the waste in the first place. Now, if you must know, there is a certain lady... now, even you must know there is a certain lady in the waste who is very bad news. She promised to fry me alive last year. She sent a curse out after me. I've only avoided so far because I had the sense to give her a false name. Sophie was almost awed. You mean you jilted the Witch of the Waste? Hal cut himself another lump of cake, looking sad and honourable. That is not the way to put it. I admit I thought I was fond of her for a time. She is in some ways a very sad lady, very unloved. Every man in Ingery is scared stiff of her. You ought to know how that feels, Sophie dear. Sophie's mouth opened in utter indignation. Michael said quickly, Do you think we should move to the castle? That's why you invented it, wasn't it? That depends on Calcifer. Hal looked over his shoulder at the barely smoking logs again. I must say, if I think the king and the witch both after me, I get a craving for planting my castle on a nice frowning rock 1,000 miles away. Michael obviously wished he had not spoken. Sophie could see he was thinking that 1,000 miles was a terribly long way away from Martha. But what happens to your Letty Hatter? She said. What happens to your Letty Hatter? She said to Howl. If you up and move. I expect that will all be over with by then, Howl said, absently. But if I could only think of a way to get the king off my back. I know. He lifted his fork, with a melting hunk of cream and cake on it, and pointed it at Sophie. You can blacken my name to the king. You can pretend to be my old mother, and plead for your blue-eyed boy. He gave Sophie the smile which had no doubt charmed the Witch of the Waste, and possibly Letty too, firing it along the fork across the cream straight into Sophie's eyes. Dazzlingly. If you can bully Calcifer, the king should give you no trouble at all. Sophie stared through the dazzle and said nothing. This, she thought, was where she slivered out. She was leaving. It was too bad about Calcifer's contract. She had had enough of Howl. First green slime, then glaring at her for something Calcifer had done quite freely, and now this. Tomorrow she would slip off to Upper Folding and tell Letty all about it. Chapter 8, in which Sophie leaves the castle in several directions at once. I'm just going to have a sip of drink. To Sophie's relief, Calcifer blazed up bright and cheerful next morning. If she had not had enough of Howl, she would have been almost touched by how glad Howl was to see Calcifer. "I thought she had done for you, you old ball of gas," Howl said, kneeling at the hearth where his sleeves trailing in the ash. "I was only tired," Calcifer said. "There was some kind of drag on the castle. I'd never taken off that fast before." "Well, don't let her make you do it again," said Howl. He stood up gracefully, brushing ash off his grey and scarlet suit. "Make a start on that spell today, Michael, and if anyone comes from the king, I'm away on urgent private business until tomorrow. I'm going to see Letty, but you needn't tell him that." He picked up his guitar and opened the door with the knob green down onto the wide, cloudy hills. The Scarecrow was there again. When Howl opened the door, it pitched sideways across him, with its turnip face in his chest. The guitar uttered an awful twang, twang. Sophie gave a faint squawk of terror and hung onto the chair. One of the Scarecrow's stick arms was scraping stiffly around to get a purchase on the door. From the way Howl's feet were braced, it was clear he was being shoved quite hard. There was no doubt that the thing was determined to get into the castle. Calcifer's blue face leaned out of the grate. Michael stood stock still beyond. "There really is a Scarecrow," they both said. "Oh, is there? Do tell," Howl panted. He got one foot up against the doorframe and heaved. The Scarecrow flew lumpishly away backwards to land with a light rustle in the heather some yards off. It sprang up instantly and came hopping towards the castle again. Howl hurriedly laid the guitar on the doorstep and jumped down to meet it. No, you don't, my friend," he said with one hand out. "Go back where you came from." He walked forward slowly, still with his hand out. The Scarecrow retreated a little, hopping slowly and warily backwards. When Howl stopped, the Scarecrow stopped too, with its one leg planted in the heather and its ragged arms tilting this way and that, like a person sparring for an opening. The rags fluttering on its arms seemed a mad imitation of Howl's sleeves. "So, you won't go," Howl said, and the turnip head slowly moved from side to side. "No." "I'm afraid you'll have to," Howl said. "You scare Sophie, and there's no knowing what she'll do when she's scared. Come to think of it, you scared me too." Howl's arms moved heavily, as if he was lifting a large weight, until they were raised high above his head. He shouted out a strange word, which was still half hidden in a crack of sudden thunder, and the Scarecrow went soaring away. Up and backwards it went, rags fluttering, arms wheeling in protest, up and out and on and on and on, until it was a soaring speck in the sky, then a vanishing point in the clouds, and then not to be seen at all. Howl lowered his arms and came back to the doorway, mopping his face on the back of his hand. "I take back my hard word, Sophie," he said, panting. "That thing was alarming. It may have been dragging the castle back all yesterday. I had some of the strongest magic I've met. Whatever it was left on the last person you... Whatever was it? All that was left of the last person you cleaned for?" Sophie gave a weak little cackle of laughter. Her heart was behaving badly again. Howl realised something was wrong with her. He jumped inwards, across the guitar, and took hold of her elbow and sat her in the chair. "Take it easy now." Something happened between Howl and Calcifer then. Sophie felt it, because she was being held by Howl, and Calcifer was still leaning out of the grate. Whatever it was, her heart began to behave properly almost at once. Howl looked at Calcifer, shrugged, and turned away to give Michael a whole lot of instructions about making Sophie keep quiet for the rest of the day. Then he picked up the guitar and left at last. Sophie lay in the chair and pretended to feel twice as ill as she did. She had to let Howl get out of sight. It was a nuisance he was going to Upper Folding as well, but she would walk so much more slowly than she would arrive around the time he started back. The important thing was to not meet him on the way. She watched Michael slyly while he spread out the spell and scratched his head over it. He waited until he dragged big leather books off the shelves and began making notes in a frantic, depressed sort of way. When he seemed properly absorbed, Sophie muttered several times, "Stuffy in here." Michael took no notice. "Terribly stuffy," Sophie said, getting up and shambling to the door. Fresh air. She opened the door and climbed out. Calcifer obligingly stopped the castle dead while she did. Sophie landed in the heather and took a look around to get her bearings. The road over the hills to Upper Folding was a sandy line through the heather just downhill from the castle. Naturally, Calcifer would not make the thing inconvenient for Howl. Sophie set off towards it. She felt a little sad. She was going to miss Michael and Calcifer. She was almost at the road when there was a shouting behind her. Michael came bounding down the hillside after her, and the tall black castle came bobbing along behind him, shedding anxious puffs of smoke from all four turrets. What are you doing? Michael said when he caught up. From the way he looked at her, Sophie could see he thought the Scarecrow had sent her the wrong in the head. I'm perfectly all right, Sophie said indignantly. I'm simply going to my other sister's granddaughter. She's called Letty Hatter too. Now do you understand? Where does she live? Michael demanded, as if he thought Sophie might not know. Upper Folding, said Sophie. But that's over 10 miles away, Michael said. I promised Howl I'd make you rest. I can't let you go. I told him I won't let you out my sight. Sophie did not look very kindly on this. Howl thought she was youthful now because he wanted her to see the king. Of course he didn't want her to leave the castle. She said. Besides, said Michael, slowly grasping the situation, Howl must have gone to the Upper Folding too. I'm quite sure he has, said Sophie. Then you're anxious about this girl, if she's your great-grandniece, Michael said, arriving to the point at last. I see. I can't let you go. I'm going, said Sophie. But if Howl sees you there, he'll be furious, Michael went on, working things out. Because I promised him he'll be mad with both of us. You ought to rest. Then, when Sophie was almost ready to hit him, he exclaimed, Wait, there's a pair of 7-league boots in the broom cupboard. He took Sophie by her skinny old wrist and towed her uphill to the waiting castle. She was forced to give a little hops in order not to catch her feet in the heather. But, she panted, 7 leagues? It's 21 miles. I'll be halfway to Porthaven in 2 strides. No, it's 10.5 miles by step, said Michael. That makes Upper Folding almost exactly. If we take 1 boot and go together, then I won't be letting you out of my sight, and you won't be doing anything strenuous. And we'll get there before Howl does, so he won't even know we've been. That solves all our problems beautifully. Michael was so pleased with himself that Sophie did not have the heart to protest. She shrugged and supposed Michael had better find out about these 2 Letties before they changed looks again. It was more honest this way, but when Michael fetched the boots from the broom cupboard, Sophie began to have doubts. Up till now, she thought they were 2 leather buckets that had somehow lost their handles and then got a little squashed. You're supposed to put your foot in them, shoe and all, Michael explained, as he carried the 2 heavy bucket-shaped things to the door. These are the prototypes of the boots Howl made for the king's army. We managed to get the later ones a bit lighter and a bit more boot-shaped. He and Sophie sat at the doorstep and each put 1 foot in a boot. Point yourself towards Upper Folding before you put the boot down, Michael warned her. He and Sophie stood up on the foot, which was in an ordinary shoe, and carefully swung themselves round to face Upper Folding. Now tread, he said. Zip! The landscape instantly rushed past them so fast it was only a blur, a grey-green blur for the land and blue-grey blur for the sky. The wind on their going tore at Sophie's hair and dragged every wrinkle in her face backwards until she thought she would arrive with half her face behind each ear. The rushing stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Everything was calm and sunny. They were knee-deep in buttercups in the middle of the Upper Folding Village common. A cow nearby stared at them. Beyond it, thatched cottages drowsed under trees. Unfortunately, the bucket-like boot was so heavy that Sophie staggered as she landed. Don't put that foot down, Michael yelled. Too late. There was another zipping blur, more rushing wind. When it stopped, Sophie found herself right down the Folding Valley, almost into Marsh Folding. Oh, drat, she said, and hopped carefully round with her other shoe and tried again. Zip, blur, and she was back on upper folding green. Again, staggering forward with the weight of the boot, she had a glimpse of Michael diving to catch her. Zip, blur. Oh, bother, wailed Sophie. She was up in the hills again. The crooked black shape of the castle was drifting peacefully nearby. Calcifer was amusing himself blowing black smoke rings from one turret. Sophie saw that much before her shoe caught in the heather, and she stumbled forwards again. Zip, zip. This time Sophie visited in rapid succession the market square of Market Chipping and the front lawn of a very grand mansion. Blow, she cried. Drat! One word for each place, and she was off again with her own momentum, and another zip, right down to the end of the valley in a field somewhere. A large red bull raised its ring nose from the grass and thoughtfully lowered its horns. I'm just leaving, my good beast, Sophie cried, hopping herself round frantically. Zip, back to the mansion. Zip, to Market Square. Zip, and there was the castle again. She was getting the hang of it. Zip, here was upper folding. But how did you stop? Zip. Oh, confound it, Sophie cried, almost in marsh folding again. This time she hopped around very carefully and trod with great deliberation. Zip, and fortunately the boot landed in a cowpat and she sat down with a thump. Michael sprinted up before Sophie could move and dragged the boot off her foot. Ah, thank you, Sophie cried breathlessly. There seemed to be no reason why I should ever stop. Sophie's heart pounded a bit as they walked across the common to Mrs. Fairfax's house, but only in the way hearts do when you've done a lot rather quickly. She felt very grateful for whatever Howl and Calcifer had done. Nice place, Michael remarked as he hid the boots in Mrs. Fairfax's hedge. Sophie agreed. The house was the biggest in the village. It was thatched with white walls between black beams, and as Sophie remembered from visits as a child, you walked up to the porch for a garden crowded with flowers and humming with bees. Over the porch, a honeysuckle and a white climbing rose were competing as to which could give the most work to the bees. It was a perfect hot summer morning down here in Upper Folding. Mrs. Fairfax answered the door herself. She was one of those plump, comfortable ladies with swathes of butter-coloured hair coiled round her head, who made you feel good with life just to look at her. Sophie felt just a tiny bit envious of Letty. Mrs. Fairfax looked from Sophie to Michael. She had seen Sophie last a year ago, as a girl of 17. There was no reason for her to recognise her as an old woman of 90. Good morning to you, she said politely. Sophie sighed. Michael said, This is Letty Hatter's great-aunt. I brought her here to see Letty. Oh, I thought the face looked familiar, Miss Fairfax exclaimed. There's quite a family likeness. Do come in. Letty's a little busy just now, but I'll have some scones and honey while you wait. She opened her front door wider. Instantly, a large collie dog squeezed past Mrs. Fairfax's skirts, barged between Sophie and Michael, and ran across the nearest flower bed, snapping off flowers left and right. Oh, stop him, Miss Fairfax gasped, flying off in pursuit. I don't want him out just now. There was a minute or so of helter-skelter chase, in which the dog ran hither and thither, whining in a disturbed way, and Mrs. Fairfax and Sophie ran after the dog, jumping flower beds and getting in one another's way, and Michael ran after Sophie, crying, Stop! You'll make yourself ill! Then the dog set off loping round one corner of the house. Michael realised that the way to stop Sophie was to stop the dog. He made a crosswise dash through the flower beds, plunged round the house after the dog, and seized it by 2 handfuls of its thick coat, just as it reached the orchard at the back. Sophie hobbled up to find Michael pulling the dog away backwards and making such strange faces at her that she thought at first he was ill. But he jerked his head so often towards the orchard that she realised he was only trying to tell her something. She stuck her face round the corner of the house, expecting to see a swarm of bees. Howl was there with Letty. They were in a grove of mossy apple trees in full bloom, with a row of beehives in the distance. Letty sat in a white garden seat. Howl was kneeling on one knee in the grass at her feet, holding one of her hands and looking noble and ardent. Letty was smiling lovingly at him. But the worst of it, as far as Sophie was concerned, was that Letty did not look like Martha at all. She was her own extremely beautiful self. She was wearing a dress into the same kind of pinks and white as the crowded apple blossoms overhead. Her dark hair trailed in glossy curls over one shoulder, and her eyes shone with devotion for Howl. Sophie brought her head back round the corner and looked with dismay at Michael, holding the whining collie. "He must have had a speed spell with him," Michael whispered, equally dismayed. Mrs. Fairfax caught them up, panting and trying to pin back a loose coil of her buttery hair. "Bad dog," she said, in a fierce whisper to the collie. "I'll put a spell on you if you do that once more." The dog blinked and crouched down. Mrs. Fairfax pointed a stern finger. "Into the house. Stay in the house." The collie shook himself free of Michael's hands and slunk away around the house again. "Thank you so much," Mrs. Fairfax said to Michael, as they all followed it. "He will keep trying to bite Letty's visitor. Inside!" she shouted sternly in the front garden, as the collie seemed to be thinking of going round the house and getting to the orchard the other way. The dog gave her a woeful look over its shoulder and crawled dismally indoors through the porch. "That dog may have the right idea," Sophie said. "Mrs. Fairfax, do you know whose Letty's visitor is?" That dog, Mrs. Fairfax chuckled. "The wizard Pendragon, or Howl, whatever he calls himself," she said. "But Letty and I don't let on we know. It amused me when he first turned up, calling himself Sylvester Oak, because I could see he'd forgotten me. But I hadn't forgotten him, even though his hair used to be black in his student days." Mrs. Fairfax by now had her hands folded in front of her, and she was standing bolt upright, prepared to talk all day, as Sophie had often seen her do before. "He was my old tutor's very last pupil, you know, before she retired. When Mr. Fairfax was alive, he used to like me to transport us both to Kingsbury to see a show from time to time. I can manage to very nicely, if I take it slowly. And I always used to drop in on old Miss Pentstemon while I was there. She likes her old pupils to keep in touch, and one time she introduced this young Howl to us. Oh, she was proud of him. She taught Wizard Solomon too, you know, and she said Howl was twice as good." "But don't you know the reputation Howl has?" Michael interrupted. Getting into Mrs. Fairfax's conversation was rather like getting into a turning skipping rope. You had to choose the exact moment, but once you were in, you were in. Mrs. Fairfax turned herself slightly to face Michael. "Most of it's just talk to my mind," she said. Michael opened his mouth to say that it was not, but he was in the skipping rope again, and it went on tumbling. "And I said to Letty, 'Here's your big chance, my love. I know Howl could teach her 20 times more than I could, for I don't mind telling you, Letty's brains go way behind mine. And she could end up in the same league as the Witch of the Waste, only in a good way. Letty's a good girl, and I'm fond of her. If Mrs. Pentstemon was still teaching, I'd have Letty to her tomorrow. But she isn't, so I said, 'Letty, here's Wizard Howl courting you, and you could do worse than fall in love with him yourself, and let him be your teacher. The pair of you will go far.' I don't think Letty was too keen on the idea at first, but she's been softening lately, and today seems to be going beautifully." Here, Mrs. Fairfax paused to beam benevolently at Michael, and Sophie dashed into the skipping rope for her return. "But someone told me Letty was fond of someone else," she said. "Sorry for him, you mean," said Mrs. Fairfax. She lowered her voice. "There's a terrible disability there," she whispered suggestively, "and it's asking too much of any girl. I told him I'm sorry for him myself." Sophie managed a mystified, "Oh?" "But it's a fearsomely strong spell. It's very sad," Mrs. Fairfax wound on. "I had to tell him there's no way someone of my abilities can break something that's put on by the Witch of the Waste. Howl might, but of course he can't ask Howl. How can he?" Here, Michael, who kept looking nervously to the corner of the house in case Howl came round it, and discovered them, managed to trample through the skipping rope and stop it by saying, "I think we better get going." "Are you sure you won't come in for a taste of my honey?" said Mrs. Fairfax. "I use it in nearly all of my spells, you know." And she was off again, this time about the magical properties of honey. Michael and Sophie walked purposely down the path to the gate, and Mrs. Fairfax drifted behind them, talking away and sorrowfully straightening plants that the dog had bent as she talked. Sophie, meanwhile, racked her brains for a way to find out how Mrs. Fairfax knew Letty was Letty, without upsetting Michael. Mrs. Fairfax paused to gasp a bit as she heaved a large lupin upright. Sophie took the plunge. Mrs. Fairfax, wasn't it my niece Martha who was supposed to come to you? Naughty girls, Mrs. Fairfax said, smiling and shaking her head as she emerged from the lupin. As if I wouldn't recognise one of my own honey-based spells. But, as I said to her at the time, I'm not one to keep anyone against their will, and I'd always rather teach someone who wants to learn. Only, I said to her, I have no pretence here. You stay as your own self, or not at all. And it's worked out very happily, as you see. Are you sure you won't stay and ask her for yourself? I think we better go, Sophie said. We have to get back, Michael added, with another nervous look towards the orchard. He collected the 7-league boots from the hedge and sat down outside the gate for Sophie. And I'm going to hold on to you this time, he said. Mrs. Fairfax leaned over her gate while Sophie inserted her foot into the boot. 7 leaguers, she said. Would you believe it? I've not seen one of those for years. Very useful things for someone your age, Mrs. I wouldn't mind a pair myself these days. So it's you Letty inherits her witchcraft from, is it? Not that it necessarily runs in families, but as often as not. Michael took a hold of Sophie's arm and pulled. Both boots came down on the rest of Mrs. Fairfax's talk, and the rest of Mrs. Fairfax's talk vanished in the zip and rush of air. Next moment, Michael had to brace his feet in order to not collide with the castle. The door was open. Inside, Calcifer was roaring, Porthaven door! Someone's been banging on it ever since you left! And with that, I'll end it here for today. Thank you if you were lurking, or if you're part of Vodgang. And like I said, we've got a few more chapters left to go. Probably be able to do it in 1 or 2 more streams. And then I'll be editing it into one long audiobook style thing. So yeah, I hope you have a wonderful evening, rest of your day, or whatever you're doing. Okay, bye-bye, 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 bye. Bye.